Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. You're welcome to my allotment again. So yeah, it's been another week on the plot and let's see what I got up to, eh? Whoa! Where did the sun go? I was looking forward to sitting out here in the sunshine talking to you guys, but not gonna happen, I guess. Weather's been on and off. But it's getting slightly warmer, so I'm happy about that. And we might have had our last cold night last night for a while, at least for the next 10 days. So that's like the dream. I hope you're also getting some warmer temperatures where you are, because it makes all the difference at night for your seedlings. Things are growing, but they're growing slowly, I'd say. Very much behind. So in last week's vlog I sowed my basil, right? And I published on Instagram my method of sowing in straight perlite, and people went a bit mental for it. I don't really know why. I guess people don't realize that you can grow stuff straight into perlite. But it's a good thing to do with basil if you're struggling getting it to germinate, because they want to be moist and warm, right? But they do not want to be soggy, and just sowing them on the top of compost will work too. But if you're an overzealous waterer or you just can't stop yourself from watering, then maybe going for perlite is a better option. Anyway, they were ready to be pricked out, or maybe it was the vlog before I sowed basil. I lose track. Anyway, it was time to prick them out. They've been inside my house sitting on top of the radiator with some cling film over the top of the trays basically, and then I had 4 varieties, and pricking them out is a bit fiddly because they're so small, but they are susceptibly small, right? So they are actually quite large plants once they get growing. And even though when you buy them in the supermarket they ram in like multiple plants in one pot, it's not ideal when you're growing them yourself. So it would be better to prick them out singly into modules and then grow them on, pot them on into a bigger pot when they need it, and then plant that out into the position with the tomatoes at the time. And they'll, because you keep pinching the top, right, when you're harvesting, it keeps bushing out, so it becomes quite a large plant in the end. And if they're too close, you're going to hamper the growth. So by having single plants and at appropriate distance apart, it means that you maximize the yield from each plant. And the thing about basil is that it's quite tricky to grow in the UK climate. They really don't like our summer weather with wind and rain or even hail. I think we had hail in June last year. So they will get pockmarked leaves, and they will be stressed, and they'll flower sooner than they would if you grow them under cover, either in a greenhouse or a polytunnel or in a cold frame. They will just benefit from that protection from our weather. Unless it is a glorious summer like we had in 2018, then you can even grow basil outside, right? With great success. But if you want those lush soft green leaves to go with your caprese salad of homegrown tomatoes and onions, then yeah, it's best to cover them up. So I grew 4 varieties of basil, right, and 3 of them, the cinnamon, the lemon and the Greek, were all fresh seed, and the sweet Genovese is fairly old seed now and not surprisingly had the worst germination. I still got enough, but I might want to sow some more of that just in case, because you never know with those tiny seedlings, especially now that it's so cold, they might not like it. So we'll see. And it's still plenty of time to grow basil. They'll grow much better once it gets warmer. And that's the thing about this spring, like it's so cold and a lot of us feel like we're behind, but because it's cold we're not actually behind. Some things would have not done well if we sowed them earlier, so it's definitely still time to grow most things. Maybe not broad beans or garlic, right? But a lot of other things that you sow now in spring. There's still plenty of time for all of those. So the basil, I did a taste test, right, to see if I could taste any difference between them. And actually I couldn't. The only one that tasted differently was the cinnamon one, which was super aniseedy. So yeah, and when you grow your own basil, like nothing tastes like homegrown basil. But they are usually more aniseedy in flavor, I find. So it can be a bit of a shock to the system if you're used to the bland ones from the supermarket. But it's so worth it. Like you a little bit goes a long way with homegrown basil, I find. I'm still gonna sow more though. So I showed you last time that the bubble wrap that I put on my greenhouse just all fell down overnight, right? So I got a lot of tips, right, of these clips that you fit into the metal on the greenhouse. So they finally arrived and I managed to get the bubble wrap back in place and it's worked much better. There's a few little bits because I've had to patch up with smaller pieces that are still falling down because they're only held up with tape. But it's manageable now. It's not the whole thing is falling down, right? So that's a much better improvement. And I finally lit the paraffin heater to try to work out how it works, because the instructions it comes with obviously are not the best. And because I wanted to try it out before I start moving all the tomatoes out there. And it wasn't the coldest night that night, so I thought I'd give it a go. And oh my god, it's so smelly. Like if you don't light it correctly, it produces lots of fumes. And yeah, so you really need to get that flame height correct. But it did heat it enough so that the basil that I left in there was fine. So basil again is very frost sensitive, just like tomatoes, right? So you don't want to expose them to frost. And it turned out that it was quite a few degrees warmer in the small greenhouse compared to the large greenhouse. So then, because I managed to get the little greenhouse up and running and as warm as it could be, I decided it was definitely time to pot on my second sowing of tomatoes. So they'd been in those CD60 modules from that Charles Dowding designed, right? So they were in quite small modules. And they'd been under a grow light, and the grow light had been sitting very close. So a lot of them were very, very dark in color, almost purple. So I know I had comments before about people worrying about their tomatoes being purple, but it's not a problem. It's just that they have got like not a sunburn, but they've got a tan, right? So actually as a matter of fact, it's quite good if you're moving them out into real sunlight that they're already that color, because it means that they're not gonna burn or get sun scorched like my first lot of tomatoes, so which were like pale green when they went out into the sun. So yes, so anyway, it was time to pot them up, and germination was good and they were much more compact, because at the later sowing I didn't keep the propagator lid on too long, which I did with my first lot, because it's sort of a trade-off when you sow that many in one tray. You want to keep the moisture in, the humidity in, to germinate most of the seeds, but once they've germinated they don't want that humidity anymore, because it gets too warm and then they grow leggy too quickly. So this time I did it right. I took it off sooner than I did last time, so the ones that grew much better, and then I might have had to wait a bit longer for all of them to germinate, but the trade-off worked this year because it's been so cold anyway, so I couldn't have moved them out. So yes, much better this time around, and I will have to go through my earlier lot of tomatoes that all got sun scorched and like threw the ones away that are looking too horrible, and that I have newer ones coming that are much better nick, right? So I have to do an audit, and yeah, we'll see where we end up. I can probably get rid of quite a lot of them. I think the only one that I have now lost is the racy tomato. I can't pronounce that, but it's the one that is like a pocket tomato, I think it's called. It's got lots of little I think it is cherry plum tomatoes that are fused into one, if you see what I mean. So that one, all those seedlings died, so I might sow a few more of those. But do I need another variety of tomato? No. But I was quite excited about that one, so maybe I'll give it another go. Maybe I'll take in a small pot into the house and just sow some more seeds. It's definitely not too late to sow more tomatoes. If anything, this cold spring they might do better, be less leggy, and just have a better start in life. So the tomatoes then spent the night in the greenhouse, and they were fine. So again, it was not the coldest. I think it only went down to like 5 degrees that night, so it was a safer night to try it, and they also had fleece over them in there. I didn't light the burner that time, because it wasn't going to be cold enough. It wasn't no risk of frost. So if you watch my what I'm sowing in April video, I talked about not sowing any of the squash family in April, and I stuck to that, and I'm quite glad, again, because it's been so cold. It's definitely not come back and bit me. So why I decided to do that is because I don't have the indoor space to keep them, and squash grows so fast. So you can direct sow squash after your last frost date or in June, and they will probably grow really well, unless you have lots and lots of slugs that might just devour them, right? So I would advise storing them in modules if you can, and it's definitely still time to do all that. And I sowed all my 15 winter squash, all my summer squash, all my courgettes, all my cucumbers, indoor and outdoor, and then cucamelons, and something called achocha or achocha, I'm not really sure. I think the nickname is Fat Baby. I've not grown them before, but they're part of the same family, and you eat them quite young. They're really prickly fruit, and you can't eat the seeds because they're really hard. But once you've deseeded them and cut them up and cook them, they taste like green peppers. So I'm definitely willing to give it a go, and they apparently can grow outside. So yeah, definitely up for trying that one. And it's a scrambling vine as well, so it'll need to go up, I guess. I have a lot of vertical supports to build this year, and but I have a lot of sticks, so I think it should be okay. So for all those seeds, I went with 2 of each variety, because they're usually very good at germinating, though this year, judging by the melons, it's not been a great year. But I have managed to get on top of the fungus gnat problem now in my house, so hopefully that means that most of them should germinate. As I have so many, I can definitely not grow more than 1 of each. Perhaps more than 1 of the indoor cucumbers because they're so tasty, and maybe more than 1 of the smaller squash like the uchiki curry or the crown prince, because the crown prince is so tasty. I know it's an F1 variety, but oh my god, it is the best tasting one I have ever had, and I grew quite a lot of varieties last year. Just so tasty. It has like another dimension to the flavor basically, so well worth growing. And even though the seeds are expensive, I think it's worth it because it really adds a different flavor to your shop bought butternut or whatever, you know. It's definitely an improvement. It's not just fun to grow, it's actually an improvement on flavor. So I sowed all those seeds on their edges in a CD60 again, just like I did with the sunflowers. And as with the sunflowers, as soon as they pop up, I'm gonna have to pot them on. But I think that'll be a good tactic, so I can leave them in the tray inside the house until they're large enough to pop out and plant up, and then once that's happened I can put them out into the small greenhouse. So I think that's a very good tactic, and then they won't have a risk of going leggy, and they'll be adapted to the greenhouse light from early on. But just to say, if I didn't make myself clear, the squash family, they all need 25 degrees to germinate. So put your tray with the propagator lid over near a radiator or on a heat mat. Don't leave them in the greenhouse or in your shed or whatever, or preferably not just on the shelf in your house, though that's better than nothing, right? But close to a radiator or in an airing cupboard or something like that, and they'll germinate much quicker for you. So I was quickly running out of like plant labels that I use, and I prefer to use wood because they inevitably always end up in my compost. And yes, you know, if you try to buy anything that has garden related or gardening attached to it or plant, it's like 50% more expensive. But I found these craft sticks, which I guess is for making crafts, on Amazon, and they're much cheaper, and I bought like 2 boxes like this. So it's gonna last me a long time. I think this was like £14 for 2 boxes of, I think it's like 2,000 sticks, right? So I'll be fine for like the next year or 3. So that's great. I'll put the links, so these are all affiliate links to my Amazon shop down below in the description, as always. So anything I mention in my videos. If I have links to them, I'll put them in the description. And if there's something I'm not linking, then just ask me about it. And now the sun is back. And it was actually raining. I don't know if you noticed, but yeah, it's definitely spring in Britain. Ow! Sorry. Oh, I keep hitting my head on this strawberry planter. Anyway, I knew that was going to happen. But while I have your attention, would you consider giving this video a thumbs up if you're enjoying it and if you're finding it useful, because it really helps me finding out what works and what doesn't and what you want to see more of. Anyway, thanks for that, and let's get back to the video. So in April, there was that crazy snow that just appeared overnight. Do you remember? Like really thick, wet snow. But this month, we've been having hail instead. So we got hail in June last year. And I had planted out all my squash. So I remember specifically my giant pumpkin, which has those massive leaves, right? They were so damaged by the hailstones going through them. So I ended up having to cut off quite a lot of the leaves. And I don't know if that was partly why the squash didn't do as well as predicted last year. I mean, I did end up getting like 15 squash anyway, which is plenty. But I didn't get a giant pumpkin for various reasons. And there was only more than one squash per plant on a few of them. Like one of the crown prince had 3 squash, and one of the 2 uchikikuri plants had 2 each, but all the other ones just had 1 squash per plant, and that's not normal per se. But I think so. It could have been that it could have been the late frost we had in May, or the hail that came later, or the not so great summer. Like we didn't have enough sunlight days or hours that summer, I felt, and they really want that kind of weather, don't they? But yeah, speaking of squash from last year, my last standing squash was the blue banana. So that was a seedling that I got from my plot neighbour, together with one called Candy Roaster. They were both gorgeous, and I was so happy that I got them. At the time I'm like, oh, I don't have space for these, but then obviously planted them up anyway, and they grew vertically, and they grew really well vertically, even though the blue banana is a massive squash, right? I think it weighed, I'll have to find out, if it was 4.7 kilos, so it's quite heavy for a squash. And I had to use fruit netting to tie up underneath it to support it, because the stem had started cracking, right? So that's a sort of a sign that it's getting a little bit heavy. But yes, so the blue banana is one of them heirloom varieties from real seeds, and it's got a long history among the Native American tribes. You know, it's an old variety, and it's especially good for storage. So it starts out being green. So for the longest time I was like, it's called blue banana, why is it called blue banana? But the more and more matured, it got this teal color. It's a gorgeous teal color. And finally I was like, okay, that's blue enough. So then I harvested it, and I have had it in my house until now. And it was showing no signs of deterioration. It was not going moldy or soft or anything. It was maybe getting, it was shrinking a little bit, but I guess that's from the evaporation of the moisture. And I was desperate to get more seeds, and I kept checking the Real Seeds websites from like, I don't know, October last year, like where are the seeds, where are the seeds? But because, and it specifically says, I think, that you're supposed to not eat this squash until after the new year, because it develops in flavor. So then I understand why the seeds weren't available until I think March. But I finally got my hands on some seeds. Because the squash family are so promiscuous in their cross-pollination, I've never wanted to keep the seeds of the ones I grow, because I don't control the pollination. And they're such large plants, and they are such an investment, that you don't want to end up growing something that will produce fruit that's disgusting, which can happen. Because it was growing like amongst like, I don't know, I think 10 other squash plants. So it was definitely a high risk that I was not going to be, and the seed was not going to produce a pure plant. So yes, I finally managed to get some seeds, so I'm growing it this year too. And yeah, I mean, when I opened this one now, oh my god, it's so hard to open squash. Like, I know it's easier if you roast it sort of first, and then it's much softer to cut, but wow, yeah. And at the time I was trying to film it for Instagram, right? So it kept like rolling off the board, because it's like just like round like a zeppelin, right? But yes, it's gorgeous, and you can just cut off a ring and roast that and keep the rest in the fridge. And the seeds, I was a bit worried because some squash, when you keep them for longer, then they're destined to, the seeds start to germinate inside, but that hadn't happened at all. So I probably could have kept that one until the summer or even beyond that. So yeah, that one's a great one to grow. And guess what? I finally got around to potting up my dahlias. So I ordered quite a few, and they've been sitting in a box inside my unheated bathroom for a long time, right? And finally I managed to get the time to pot them up. So they're all behind me in the greenhouse here, and I've made a video. That might not come out before this one though, but if you're watching behind, I will have linked it, so either look out for it, or when you're watching this it might be linked. Never mind. So it'll be a haul video of all the varieties with pictures and how to, but it's really straightforward to pot them up. So part of that was potting up the massive lump of dahlias that I got from Old Tom, my plot neighbour. So I did a little bit of footage for that, for the vlog, when I did that, so I'll put that in here. So if you remember, I got a section of my plot neighbour's, Old Tom's, massive white cactus dahlia. He just like took a spade to it, and I got like a massive clump. So when I separated out, a lot of them were, he doesn't dig them up, so they've been growing like insane. So a lot of them were rotting, a lot of the tubers were rotting. But I managed to salvage quite a few, and I potted them up, and this is the largest one, and it has started growing. You see the roots as well as the shoots. So I'm gonna pot them up in individual pots, especially this one because it's massive. But a lot of the ones are a bit smaller, and a lot of the ones that I thought were just storage roots, and I potted up just because, have obviously had eyes on them and started shooting. I don't know if you can see those little green ones there, and way more than I actually want. So there's like maybe 10 tubers, but I'm gonna keep 6. That's probably too many. It's probably more like 12 tubers that that are sprouting, but it's just too many. These are massive things. So I'm gonna pot these 6 up, and we'll see if I plant them all out. We'll see. I mean, they're gorgeous, but white dahlias are maybe not my thing, and you know, when they go over, I mean, you need to deadhead them of course, but white flowers tend to go very brown and not like great looking. They have a very short life of when they look great, and yeah, so I'll see how many I plant up, but I thought I'd just come on and say that. And because it's spring, your weeds are growing at some speed, right? So now is the time to allocate some time to weeding every time you visit your plot or your garden, because it will repay you. So if you try to get on top of it now, I know it'll feel like overwhelming, but if you try to do a little bit each time, it will get better, because the weeds will slow down when we get into summer. Now is the time of growth for your vegetables and also the weeds, and with all the rain we've had, my god, they've exploded. So while I was getting the bindweed out, I was checking on my calabrese that are part of my Grow Along for Life that I run via my emailing list. So those were seeds that we sowed in February, and my plants, even though it's been cold spring, they are now putting on some growth. And yeah, I was worried that I was going to lose a few to slugs because I've got this black plastic mulch, right? But it's been okay. They've have some nibbles, and especially since I left the mesh off for like 2 days, I completely forgot that I have pigeons here, and I realized, oh crap! So they had nibbled a few of them, but they've grown past that now, so they're doing much better. And in between the calabrese I popped in some multi-sown radishes, and I keep forgetting to check on them, and now some of them have grown massive. Like with the rain they just like swelled. And last year radishes were so bad, but that's because the spring was so dry. And this year they're absolutely delicious, and I've fallen in love with them again. So after last year I was like, I'm not growing radishes again because it just doesn't work. But yeah, they've been great this year, and I just need to remember to check on them more often. So because the little greenhouse is now up and running as a heating cocoon, I'm going through all my indoor seedlings one by one and try to transfer them out, because yeah, they're just desperate to go. And next up was the Luffas. So I moved 2 sacrificial ones out of my later sowings. They're just small seedlings, and they've been fine over like 2-3 nights. So I decided to pot on my largest Luffas because they needed larger pots. And I'm following the advice of the Luffa grower extraordinaire, Chicks and Veg. She was actually on Gardener's World talking about Luffas. And she says not to pot them on into too massive a pot when you do pot them on. But that's true for most plants, right? They don't want to go into from small to massive. It's better to do, yeah, whatever. So I did that, and they also needed support, so I found some sticks for them to grow up, because they started throwing out the little tendrils, right, to grab onto stuff. So before they started climbing up my window, it was time for them to go out. So they also spend the night outside, and I'll show you what the setup is in there. So I've perfected it now over the next few nights, and getting the flame right is crucial. So it needs to be quite low in the heater. And then I use, obviously there's bubble wrap, and then I use this fleece tenting, and the heater sits underneath it. So I only use one of the burners on the paraffin heater, because that's all that's necessary. If we get like -3 or something, then yeah, I'll use both, but just to save on the fuel, and it's not necessary to use both, I'll just use one. And you might think that this would be a fire risk with the fleece there, but it doesn't actually produce that kind of heat unless you have the flame too high, right? So it needs to be quite low to have like a diffuse sort of heat, and without this horrible fume. So it's much less smelly now when I'm doing it right. And that sort of fleece tent keeps the heat that it produces into a smaller area, because one of those heaters, even if it's a double one, it's too small to heat that. Even if it's my small greenhouse, it's too small to heat that. So by making like a small little chamber inside there, it's much more efficient. And I can tuck in all the tomatoes and all the Luffas, and hopefully soon all my other warm loving plants like the chilies and the aubergines and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the only problem is I need more shelving. So I have ordered shelving, and I think it's arrived today, so that's good. So the next stage of the big move is happening this weekend, I think. So that little construction I've got actually makes a huge difference. So last night it was 1.1 degrees in this large greenhouse, whilst in the small greenhouse underneath that fleece it was 6 degrees. So it's almost a 5 degree Celsius difference, and that is quite a lot when you're talking warm loving plants. So obviously not great for tomatoes and Luffas and stuff like that. They might not grow much, but they will benefit during the day from having the big sky. And I do remove the fleece during the day so that they can they get light filters through the bubble wrap, but it's still better than being inside. And yes, as I alluded to, next up is the chilies, because oh my god, we have a problem. The tallest, I think it's a pepper actually, the tallest one have now reached the ceiling above the shelf where they're sitting, and I have no option to move them anywhere. So yes, that is happening tomorrow, and yeah, that will be in the next week's vlog.